Great. So as far as purpose and objectives, really, what do we want to take away from today? The use of BrM in AASHTOWare OpenAPI, there are differences from prior versions of BrM. In addition to that, AASHTOWare OpenAPI has a variety of different features, inclusive of BrM, but it does extend closer to the full AASHTOWare portfolio of products. Once we've established that, we'll look at the requirements to actually use AASHTOWare OpenAPI. There are a variety of support, reference materials, technical references. However, in order to use that, there are some prerequisites. Once we've discussed the basics around AASHTOWare OpenAPI, we will delve deep into the initial elements of BrM. What do you need to do to get up and running? How do you do it? What is registration? Anything and everything relevant to those initial steps. Once we've established those initial steps and that procedure, we will jump right into data retrieval. So again, these are hands-on examples through a different, using a different set of tools, showing some very easy prototyping that's accessible immediately, as well as some platform and technology-specific examples, so that, again, if you're working in a particular environment or against a particular set of technology tools, we'll have code that you can actually look at. Once we've completed those examples and gone through the data retrieval on some of those very popular scenarios, we will go through the identification and troubleshooting processes with the typical items and typical ways to determine what problems may exist and how best to correct them. And finally, we will wrap up discussing some of the potential BrM webinar advanced topics. So today, the goal is to go from the very starting point to configuration, any prerequisites, actually get data, and then in the future, we'll have the ability to go even further in some of the more advanced scenarios and topics. So APIs in a nutshell. Typically, what you would think of with APIs or just these type of capabilities, they are really isolated to data services delivered over the web. It's a little bit more than just data retrieval. So this is something closer to manage or having the ability to manage data, to create items, to retrieve information, modify anything within the system, and then also remove or delete as necessary. So for the most part, even though it may not immediately match 100% to anything that you could do in the web application, the underlying goal or intent is if you could do it in the application, the API should provide very similar functionality. If there was a type of data process that was previously done in prior versions using the database directly, the API provides new, better, and hopefully more refined options in doing the same thing. And again, the API environment using APIs, those data services, although they may have some overlap, they are uniquely different in terms of integration from what you would do direct to the database. And with that in mind, again, AASHTOWare OpenAPI is a portfolio of APIs based on the AASHTOWare products. BrM is one of those products within that portfolio. What is in BrM is unique to BrM. So each API is different, but the underlying standards, those are universal. So again, with AASHTOWare OpenAPI and the latest version of BrM, using those universal standards, it is much easier to use your existing tools and techniques to access data and manage data with the BrM API. So let's very briefly take a look at the anatomy of an API. So again, it does behave very similar to what you would expect for any data-related service. It is delivered over the web. So the first part in looking at the BrM API is to really understand that, the starting points are very similar to what you would see in a web address. Based on those resources, you typically have some input. Those inputs are called parameters. Those parameters are assigned. And then based on a particular action, whether it is data retrieval, data addition, data modification, or data removal through a delete, the combination of that URL the input parameters, and the action that you're performing, those are what we will refer to as operations. So a typical operation would be to post information to the system to create something. Another typical operation would be to get something from the system as data retrieval, and then the same holds true for updates and deletes. So again, looking at the APIs for what we'll see in BrM, very similar to what you would see as a web address. However, the ability to provide inputs, receive outputs, and define the actions around a particular URL, that is really at the base of the API delivery. So again, as we mentioned, AASHTOWare OpenAPI is a portfolio of APIs. We will be focusing exclusively on BrM today. As the different capabilities are listed within BrM, they still adhere to a very fundamental convention that is really at the foundation of AASHTOWare OpenAPI. So with that in mind, we have the ability to support the API development use with some initial requirements. If you have, if you are accessing the BrM API, you will always go to api.ashtoware.org. The BrM API is listed in this URL, is simply BrM. And then we have the concept of an instance. So if you have an environment, let's say you are a particular state agency, you have a production environment, you have a non-production environment. However, your resources, let's say from Kentucky, are uniquely different from those in Virginia or Ohio or any other agency. So with that in mind, we introduced the concept of an instance. So if you are accessing one of your resources, you'll have an instance alias to access it. So the BrM API is the same for everyone for the most part. However, your environment will be determined specific to your installation, and how you access that will be defined by your instance. We'll go in detail in some of the examples on how this comes into play, but fundamentally, this is a convention to make life easier and then also consistent, so that regardless of the application or the utility, there is some consistency across the board. So how do you actually get to it? To access the AASHTOWare OpenAPI, the starting point is your AASHTO identity. So typically with AASHTOWare Store or with any prior AASHTO related accounts, underneath that is your AASHTO identity. Using those same credentials are what is in place so that you have a single sign-on experience. You don't have to create a new account for AASHTOWare OpenAPI. You can simply use your existing AASHTO identity. And with that, you have the ability to access the developer portal. The developer portal has all of the technical information, some of the initial prototyping tools to help aid and speed your development. And then based on your particular organization, role, or affiliation, there may be some additional requirements. However, those are constantly evolving. If you are a DOT staff member using an existing licensed AASHTO product, that is a little bit different than if you are an enterprise or commercial organization where you're not running an AASHTOWare product currently. So again, regardless of your organization and role, you can attain access. Some of the items in receiving that access or access approval do vary a little bit, but again, for the most part, regardless of your organization and your affiliation, you do have the ability to at least use the non-production capabilities of AASHTOWare OpenAPI, which includes BrM. So once you have that established, going to the developer portal, depending on your role and your organization, within 24 hours of accessing the developer portal, you will be given the additional permissions and access corresponding to your organization or affiliation. That will include the generation of a subscription key. As we go into the technical samples, one of the items that must be provided for any API request going through AASHTOWare OpenAPI, not just BrM, is your subscription key. And finally, having those items in place, if you require support, You're also able to submit those support requests, whether it's technical questions or information requests, anything and everything that is applicable to AASHTOWare OpenAPI, you will submit that through the support utility that is in the developer portal. So for an additional service to really help get acclimated to the system and then also address specific needs for use cases or scenarios, we have a formal AASHTOWare OpenAPI onboarding process. Typically, this will take about 30 minutes to an hour. It's really ideal for technical participants. We do cover items that are not solely technical, but it does give a full introduction in a technical work group setting to introduce the different tools that are available depending on your use cases and your individual requirements, how to access those tools. These are the environments that host BrM or other AASHTOWare products. How do you use lab or sandbox environments that might be isolated? If you're a DOT or if you are working with a DOT, how do you access those non-production environments? So instead of using a lab or a sandbox, you're using the real-world equivalent of the DOT information and resources. After we've completed that, typically we go through a tour and an overview of the AASHTOWare ecosystem. Some of the aspects of AASHTOWare differ slightly than what you would expect from a typical software as a service, enterprise, or commercial offering. So having a little bit of information on how that is structured is very helpful in understanding overall what can be done, best ways to approach it, the roles of individual agencies, and just really how best to make the most of the platform. If you are a non-state agency that's not running AASHTOWare products, we also have a variety of different resources. So again, in a commercial or enterprise capability, as an integrator facilitating or receiving a delegated commission from the DOT to provide some work with AASHTOWare OpenAPI. Regardless of the scenario, the Alliance program is an excellent resource. Again, going outside of the purely technical items, the Alliance program has all the information resources and can facilitate everything that falls outside of that very technical purview. So again, that is an additional resource that we typically cover during the onboarding. And then to conclude, your specific use cases, questions, technical requirements, we do allot a section of time to cover that in the onboarding as well. Okay, let's look at the very initial steps and requirements to conduct the procedure for the initial BrM access. So as part of accessing BrM, there are a few prerequisites. Number one, the content that we cover today, the samples, the procedure, those are specific to the BrM 7.0.2 release. Anything prior to that, especially with the prior 6.7 versions, even though there may be some information overlap, this is a fundamentally different offering that is in the data as well as the functionality. So it is important, in order for this to be applicable, that you are running that version of BrM. Second, we will be looking at how do you register an environment, whether it's a DOT environment or a dedicated test environment. How do you actually have that accessible through AASHTOWare OpenAPI? We did see earlier in some of the examples that there's a concept of an instance alias. However, behind that is an actual installation of BrM with a URL to the BrM API. In order to use AASHTOWare OpenAPI for BrM, that registration has to occur in order to access the environment. After we've completed the basic registration so that the AASHTOWare OpenAPI can deliver BrM, it is important to make sure that based on your purposes, your role, your organization, your affiliation, that the appropriate level of access or grants are included. So again, some of the items that are not necessarily technical are addressed in detail with information to determine what is the best fit for your scenario. That is handled through the Alliance program, provided you have the necessary access or the requirements in order to use these particular sets of APIs. That would be associated with your account, and then you would be able to move forward and actually begin prototyping. So as far as the prototyping, typically you will create an application, some type of utility, however that would be done in your toolbox of choice. Within the developer portal, you do have the ability to do some of that very simple initial prototyping, which is very useful for validating connectivity. Is the registration correct? Some of that initial troubleshooting if necessary. Basic prototyping is included as part of that developer portal access. So again, to get started, you don't necessarily have to have a full developer toolkit or toolbox. You can simply leverage the developer portal as it is to begin that exploration of the BrM API. The next step in the process, so although AASHTOWare OpenAPI does have some requirements in terms of access, subscription key, it does not circumvent the security and access controls of the underlying AASHTOWare product. So in order to use BrM, you have to have valid credentials. Those credentials are in the form of a client ID and a client secret. Again, these are items that are administered, managed, and accessed through the BrM application itself. AASHTOWare OpenAPI respects those settings, cannot circumvent it, but that is also a requirement in order to actually connect to the APIs and retrieve data. We'll take a brief look a little bit later on how you would go into the BrM application and actually set those up. So once you've established or have received your client ID and client secret for BrM authentication, you'll have the ability to generate an authentication token. That authentication token, very similar to the requirement of the subscription key, that authentication token from BrM is required to be included in every API call. So as we go through the step-by-step process, a couple things to keep in mind. There are two credential requirements. The first one being the AASHTOWare OpenAPI subscription key that is unique to AASHTOWare OpenAPI, that is specific to AASHTOWare OpenAPI. If you go into the developer portal, under your account profile, that's where you have access and can manage your subscription keys. For the BrM credentialing, that is specific to BrM. It is controlled within the BrM application. It is unique to the installation of BrM. So for example, a client ID and client secret, as you would expect, generated in and for Ohio will not work in Virginia. The subscription key, on the other hand, is universal to all AASHTOWare OpenAPI. Once you have it, it is for every environment, every API, every product within the portfolio. So by having those two components, you are able to access your BrM API for a particular installation and begin getting data. So we are going to move into an actual walkthrough. We're going to use the BrM Quick Start Guide, which basically is a summary of some of the key points that we just discussed. Instead of using a developer toolkit, we will actually use the developer portal as, again, that lightweight, very simple initial prototyping exploration utility. And we will begin the process of using the latest and greatest BrM to do our initial data retrieval. So let's take a look. And hopefully everyone can now see the developer portal webpage. And we will begin with the actual signing into the developer portal and using the tools. Okay, so when you typically access the developer portal, you will be presented with just a few options up until you've signed in. So again, these items, if you have not signed in, are different and somewhat restricted to what you would find within the developer portal upon logging in. So we're going to go ahead and log in so that all of those resources that are a result of your developer portal account are available. I'm using an existing AASHTOWare identity. Again, this provides a single sign-on. If you do not have an AASHTOWare identity, the instructions to get an AASHTOWare identity are also included during the login process. Great, I am now authenticated. So if you'll notice within the developer portal, I have more options. I actually have the APIs that I'm able to get to. I have a shortcut for some of the more popular reference resources, which includes the BrM Quick Start Guide. So again, the items that we have discussed so far to this point, the reference materials for that very initial access, step-by-step that is provided in the developer portal in detail by logging in and then going to the reference link in the top navigation. So for all of the available or for all of the existing AASHTOWare OpenAPIs, including BrM, using the APIs link at the top navigation, and again, this may vary depending on your role or affiliation, but all of the available APIs for your developer portal account will be listed. If you scroll down to the bottom, you will see the BrM API. And this is the source for all of your technical documentation. So as we look at the anatomy of an API, every operation within BrM, the details of the parameters, the inputs, the outputs, everything associated with the latest version of the BrM API, this is where you would find it. So you have the ability to do some basic filtering options. Typically, the operations are grouped by a tag that will help you to traverse and navigate all the different operations that are available to you. Again, even if it is not currently matching precisely every element of the web application, you will find over time the growth of different options, different methods and operations that really do mirror the core functionality of the system. So we're going to go ahead and start off with just simply doing some authentication. So the first step is in terms of accessing BrM as we discussed, and then we will look at the BrM application to see how these credentials are created. Basically, you provide a client ID, a client secret that is listed in detail from the quick start, and now we're simply walking through it. So the first step will be to create a token. So this will be the equivalent of authorization or authentication to BrM. So as we just discussed before, based on a particular installation, you will have an instance. In our case, we're using a shared resource. That instance alias name is Sandbox. And again, anything that we're doing in the developer portal, typically you would use in your technology platform of choice, whether it's just writing code directly, or if you have a productivity suite that facilitates the use of data exchanges. Regardless, the mechanisms and requirements are exactly the same. So one item that we're going to include is the actual content of the request. So this has been discussed in the Quick Start Guide, and we're just simply providing the information that is required. So per the Quick Start Guide, I'm going to get that started off. This is exactly or literally what you would submit to the BrM API in order to produce the authentication token, which would then be used in any subsequent API call, data retrieval, regardless. First, you get a token based on your credentials. You use that token, and that is part of one of the requirements for the API usage. Okay, so I did include some sensitive items, so let me go ahead and reattempt that. So one additional item that is required for the credential generation, I have to add one more value, and again, this is listed in the quick start guide. So based on the type of information that I'm sending, I have to indicate how that information is formatted. So I will go ahead and very quickly add that, and we will reattempt. Okay, so we have generated our access token. Now, as listed in the quick start guide, you use your BrM credentials to generate an access token that is more or less the valid representation that you were able to authenticate successfully, and then that can be used in the API calls themselves. So before we actually retrieve data for the different data scenarios, bridges, roadways, and locations, let's take a quick look at some of the supporting operations that are available within the BrM API that again help facilitate or gives the necessary inputs in using those subsequent APIs that we'll take a look at. So I'm going to get a list of asset types. Those asset types will be used to provide inputs to some of the examples, the hands-on examples of data retrieval. And just doing a quick search here. So any of the operations, again, they are broken down where you could do a simple or partial search. And with that search, you have the ability to then see what operations are available. And again, these are broken down based on a tag to keep them well organized. However, once you do the search, you have the ability to retrieve it. Okay, so let's give it a shot. So the first item that I will do is to include the authentication token that we received earlier. And again, these details are listed within the BrM Quick Start. And we are using the sandbox instance. So let's take a quick look at simply retrieving our asset types. And it looks like we were not quite fast enough to retrieve that. So let's give it another shot. And as you may have noticed, there is an expiration on the token. However, once you make a call, you have the ability to update that as needed. Okay, I think we'll move on. So again, with the authorization token, as long as that is correct, it will provide the data. And just to provide a sample of the end result, even though it's in a different utility, this is the expected output. So by first retrieving an asset type, you have the ability to determine the asset type IDs, which will be used later on in some of our upcoming examples. So let's take a look at how the BrM API credential is actually generated within the BrM application. So once you've accessed the BrM web application, as part of the admin restricted functionality within the BrM web application, simply go to Settings, Security, and then API Credentials. Once you have accessed that location, this is the screen that will be provided in order to generate the client ID as well as the client secret that is then used for accessing the BrM API and generating the token. When an API client ID is created, the secret will be provided and shown only at that time. So again, the client secret should be treated as something very sensitive within the use of the client ID for authentication. You see it once. If for some reason it needs to be regenerated, again, those admin utilities are in the BrM application itself. And it does require admin privileges in order to provide or to execute these operations. So as we discussed before, we were looking at the sandbox. However, the typical registration will be for an actual DOT agency installation. So when we discuss the prerequisite of getting a registered environment so that you can have the instance alias, this is an example of the information required for those registrations. So typically when you have an installation, there will be an API URL for that location. We take that URL, we then use a naming convention to get a simplified alias so that we can use it in the AASHTOWare OpenAPI according to our convention. We have the ability to do multiple registrations. The only restriction is that each instance alias for a particular API is unique. So if a particular agency has an abbreviation that is shared with other states, localities, then basically the first one to get that alias, they preserve it. But ideally, we follow a convention where each agency installation is unique, whether it's production or non-production. We kind of stick to that format to make things easier. So to further illustrate, in this case, what we were doing before with the sandbox, that is a dedicated shared prototyping environment. And in that dedicated and shared prototyping environment, the sandbox is registered as an alias. So again, some of the actions that you would typically perform within a DOT or a DOT's environment, that will differ slightly for what is being used in the shared sandbox prototyping environment. Okay, so now based on what we've gone through up to this point, that really covers the fundamental prerequisites, initial procedure before you're actually using the BrM API for very specific scenarios. So in the next examples, we will be retrieving information from that sandbox, that shared lab environment for lists of bridges, roadways, and then asset locations. So we will take a reference in terms of how we do this in the developer portal, kind of continuing where we had left off. And then we will also take a look at how do you do this in tools outside of the developer environment. We'll look at one utility that's fairly common, not necessarily a fully fledged development environment, but it is a very useful tool in exploring APIs and very quickly determining how best to use them. And then finally, for those examples, we will look at a few different implementations across different technology platforms. The first will be on the .NET side using C#. Then we will move to Python, and then we will have PL SQL example as well. Again, AASHTOWare OpenAPI, the latest version of the BrM API that does use well-adopted, widely adopted industry standards. So whatever we're doing in these few examples, they are applicable to a variety of other different technology platforms. Okay, let's take a look again. So the first operation that we will be looking at will be to very simply retrieve a list of bridges. So we're going to use the underlying asset library retrieval, and that is associated with the asset library option. So let's take a look. Okay, so the method that we'll be using is basically within the asset library tag. We will be getting information based on a particular asset type ID. That asset type ID corresponds to the bridge option, and then we will provide some additional information to either limit or page how we get that information back. Okay, let's give it a shot. So we are using the sandbox instance. And based on the prior exploration of returning all of the different asset types, we are going to take the asset type that was listed that is specific to bridges. So often you may have multiple steps to achieve your final goal of data retrieval. However, we have the concept of recipes. So within the developer portal, for some of these common operations that use the API, but it might require multiple steps, it might require some type of application configuration. Typically, we will take that and document it as a recipe, so that again, for actions like retrieving bridges, even though it takes more than one step, we'll produce a reference document for a bridge data retrieval recipe. And again, as the system is used based on the community request, that list of recipes will grow accordingly. And you also notice that the subscription key that we had discussed, that is being picked up automatically. The additional parameters determine how many results returned, and again, various filters that are applicable to this particular method itself. Okay, let's give it a shot. Okay, so this is our data result. What you'll notice is based on the inputs, based on selecting the asset type ID corresponding to bridges, as well as some additional parameters, I'm looking at 10 results in the lab environment as a list of bridges. So again, there are a number of different operations within the latest BrM API. Those are as extensive as you would expect for the application complexity. For our very rudimentary samples today, our primary goals are get bridges, get roadways, get locations. The first example that we've done, that is based on asset type equal to bridge. So as a result, the list of data that is returned is specific to bridge information. So in our second example, which will actually use the same operation, we will modify the input parameter, specifically the asset type ID. And by using a different asset type ID, we will move from retrieving bridge information into retrieving roadway information. So let's take a look. And you'll notice I'm still using the same token that was generated. Everything is the same except for the asset type ID, which determines what information is returned. Okay, so let's take a look and try it again. Okay, so before we were returning information structured for bridge results. Now, changing that filter, you'll notice that the total number of rows, even though we're just plucking out a few, all of those items that are available within the context of roadways, that number is different. So there's a different number of entries for roadway compared to bridges. Having that filter, instead of having bridge data, we now have roadway specific information. So as a starting point, and again, the developer portal is just a really great, simple tool for prototyping or exploration. It is by no means adequate to begin the development of an application or a full system. But again, for exploring, validating, just becoming familiar with what's available, it is an ideal way to very quickly get up and running. Okay, so for asset locations, this will differ as compared to bridges and highways. So we're going to look at a different resource. And in this scenario, the asset location related operations are under the tag or grouping asset location. So let's take a look. So as we have done before, we have to reference the environment that we want. If this is incorrect, you'll receive an error message that will tell you whether it's a typo, not properly or previously registered, or just incorrect. If the instance value is not correct, you'll receive an error message to that effect. The subscription key while in the developer portal is picked up automatically, regardless of operation. And hopefully we have moved quickly enough where our previous token has not expired. So we now have all of the input information for this particular operation to retrieve asset location. So let's give it a shot. Oh, it looks like I have an incorrect instance alias. So there's a good possibility I just simply misspelled it. But as you'll notice, this particular error message does indicate that something is wrong with that input. Yep, misspelled. Okay, now that that has been corrected, we would expect this particular error, an error message, to go away. So let's give it a shot. So in this case, typically, and we will discuss this in detail as far as the troubleshooting items, when there is an AASHTOWare OpenAPI originating error, some of the hints, some of the cues, even the labels will begin with an AW dash if it is originating from BrM. So if I used incorrect information and passing it along, didn't have permission, those error messages and their formats will differ. Okay, so from my prior API request that did have an incorrect parameter assignment, so the same way that sandbox was misspelled and produced an AASHTOWare OpenAPI originating error, my incorrect input for the BrM operation that produced a BrM originating error. Now that both have been corrected, you'll see that there are well over 3,000 results. Based on our input, we're only going to pluck out a few of them. And this is the result for that asset location retrieval. So as a result of these three samples, there are some similarities. And again, you notice that consistent level of how the methods, how the operations are exposed. They're fairly universal in terms of being a template. So based on what we've done today, we've retrieved bridges and highways. That had a particular approach, a very specific operation. But then when we moved on to retrieving geographic related information to get asset locations, that used a different operation. Some of the inputs were very similar. Token, always required. Subscription key, always required. Alias instance, always required. But then again, based on the operation itself, you may have different input parameters, and the way that the data is returned may also differ. So just to kind of highlight that for those three examples, now that those are concluded, bridges, roadways, asset locations, very similar, all supported through the developer portal. And again, as you review the documentation and become more familiar with the environment, I'm sure there will be additional questions and curiosities, most likely specific to the BrM API capabilities. And those are some of the items that we will definitely encourage discussion on for a later date. So let's take a look at a few different ways that we can accomplish exactly what was just done in the developer portal. So we'll have some quick code snips. With these code snips, the basic operations as performed in the developer portal, they're exactly the same. For more formal development, of course, the approach may differ, but for simple examples, these reflect what was done in those past three. So let's take a look at the .NET example. And typically what we will do in this case is no different than a standard web request. So again, given that these APIs are really delivered over the web using web standards, behaving no different than any other URL, once these are created in different technology stacks, that part stays the same. So in the .NET C# scenario, we're calling the sandbox, we're generating a token, we're using the token, all of those different items, and then returning the data from that data request. Now looking at Python, which I must admit is not my expertise, but you will notice a very similar structure. This is a web request. You provide the URL for the operation. The operation action is what dictates what is returned. Is it simply a query, or is it a modification? And in the same way that the C# snippet return data, Python performs the exact same operation. And then finally, very far outside of my expertise, Here's a PL SQL example. And again, the mechanics, the steps, the process are exactly the same. There's some nuance in the implementation specific to the platform, but again, fundamentally, it's a web request. You have some inputs that go along for the ride. As a result of that, data is returned, and then you have the ability to use that data. So we did cover a couple items in terms of troubleshooting tips and tricks. Typically, you will receive, or typically and hopefully, you will receive a meaningful and informative error message and status code reflecting whatever the underlying problem may be. So on the AASHTOWare OpenAPI side, anything prefixed with a AW dash, that indicates that something within AASHTOWare OpenAPI, even before it reaches the application, the API operations that you want, something has gone wrong. Typically, these could be permission or access errors. Again, if it is AASHTOWare OpenAPI, you will get a permissions error if the subscription key is not included. However, the error message will be to the effect of subscription key not included. Outside of AASHTOWare OpenAPI, if the BrM application permissions are not at the level necessary for your operation, you can expect a similar permission or access error. However, it'll originate from the BrM application as compared to upstream within AASHTOWare OpenAPI. So given those two different conventions, the error message, the status code, some of the details, those items are fairly critical in determining root causes. So if it is something that makes sense and it indicates that, oh, it's probably a typo, you can make the necessary corrections, reattempt. If for some reason you are unable to resolve whatever the underlying error is, that information provided can be or should be included with the support request, and getting support for that error. Simply go to the developer portal, submit your request, include the error details, and then we have the ability to help out quickly thereafter. So again, this covers some of the basic troubleshooting tips and tricks, just to make it a little bit less opaque. Typically, the error message will indicate what's wrong. If that is not ample or clear enough, submit a support request, include the information, and help will be on the way. Okay, so before we kick off the open forum Q&A, there were some recurring themes in terms of the registration poll questions. We basically took the top 10 recurring themes and have broke that into just some quick summaries. We'll speed through those, and then we'll move into the open forum portion of the webinar. So let's start with the first one. A very recurring question or need request was just getting the fundamentals of OpenAPI and BrM. So again, AASHTOWare OpenAPI is really an API platform service. It's used to deliver the AASHTOWare portfolio of APIs. So if there's a product and an API, it's probably going to go through AASHTOWare OpenAPI. For BrM specifically, now that the latest and greatest release is available, in order to use it, you use BrM delivered through AASHTOWare OpenAPI. The discussion we've had today within the webinar outlines that. What you may have done in a prior version of BrM in 6.7, and I'm sure you've noticed in the web application itself, whether it's functionality, data structure, or some combination, there is a significant difference from what was done in 6.7, how you did it, what was available, the different ways that you would access it compared to the current. So the current, latest and greatest, and going forward, AASHTOWare OpenAPI developer portal for references, documentation on what is entailed with the BrM API, and again, the original or prior versions will differ from what's available, and we basically have to look at the most recent. In terms of integration and data connectivity, BrM is an ideal hub in terms of feeding other enterprise systems or other technology investments. Having that documentation, referencing what we've done today in AASHTOWare OpenAPI, as well as really just exploring how to access different data depending on your unique needs. This particular API standard is universal. You can use code, you can use tools. There are a variety of different techniques where you can create your integrations. However, they all use the same standard. So as far as API capabilities and use cases, I will defer that to the Mayview BrM team when we get into the open forum. But basically, or at least aspirationally over time, the goal is whatever the application can do, there is an equivalent API operation or support to go along with it. So some of those more advanced scenarios, the nuances of NBI, that level of detail is best addressed or facilitated from the actual BrM team. In terms of authentication and permissions, we were able to address that. So the application management, individual agencies, policies in application management, those are what apply. AASHTOWare OpenAPI cannot get around application permissions. It's additive. So without AASHTOWare OpenAPI subscription keys, you can't even get into the yard. But in order to get through the front door, it still requires the application permissions. In terms of hands-on examples and demonstrations, we've had some very rudimentary examples today. Our experience with other AASHTOWare products up to this point, there are usually some very common scenarios that everyone needs. As mentioned before, the use of the API might require multiple steps to fulfill an objective. When those are shared, when they're common, we will typically write those up in a recipe. And that is the real world procedure, step by step. You can modify it, tailor it to suit. But basically, as we build those very common scenarios with the use of AASHTOWare OpenAPI for BrM, we document them and they can be used for reference from the developer portal. Okay, and then the last batch of questions. So as far as developing applications using OpenAPI, for the most part, the APIs are delivered with some of those technology, well-adopted, widely used standards. Typically, your development tooling set will provide the resources to reference the API and then automatically generate much of the code that we looked at today as a starting point, or more or less create a library so that it's a lot easier to use. So in terms of developing applications with AASHTOWare OpenAPI, depending on your preference, we provide the necessary coding related artifacts so that you can get up and running very quickly. For bulk data operations and automation, we do move from what would typically be seen as a database-centric bulk operation. However, since we do use web standards, web methods, you do have the ability to create highly parallel, highly performant, equally capable bulk data operations tailored to suit using only the API operations. In terms of interoperability with other systems, there's a lot more under the hood with AASHTOWare OpenAPI. So for example, the data returns that we looked at today, let's say for roadways and bridges, those are the native BrM schema-defined data outputs. AASHTOWare OpenAPI has the ability to translate from one data format to another. That can be as simple from, instead of having a textual JSON output, have a structured XML output. That can be done and is a capability of the platform. It's not something that has to be enabled within BrM. That example extends to not only how the information is delivered, XML, JSON, raw text, but also how that data is shaped. So as IFC translation, as other formats or interoperability in terms of the data shaping. As those are identified, AASHTOWare OpenAPI has the ability to include those on the existing API, but just simply delivering the data in the format of choice. In terms of resources, documentation, and training, developer portal, always the way to go. That is the primary source, or at least the best starting point. The webinar series, these will continue. The information in these webinars will be made available through the developer portal. The recordings will also be made available. In terms of training, for depending on your affiliation and your organization, we do provide beyond the onboarding initial technical work sessions, we do provide very focused, very tailored, very topic specific equivalent technical work group sessions. Depending on what is requested, how those come into play, if they are completely unique or if they are part of an ongoing common theme, that will dictate how we approach those. And then finally, future and potential use case expansion, how AI can interact with AASHTOWare. Not in this particular webinar, but in the AASHTOWare Connect, using a different AASHTOWare product as part of the AASHTOWare OpenAPI design and delivering the AASHTOWare OpenAPI product resources. We focus on the developer experience. How easy is it for a developer to create some code or create a utility using the available APIs? We have since evolved that even further. How easy is it for an AI to use the APIs delivered by AASHTOWare OpenAPI? So as far as how can AI interact, our design approach, design philosophy in terms of security, guardrails, and utility. We also include the scenario where on the other end of the request is not a developer created system or utility. It is an ad hoc, improvised AI originating request. And again, as that develops, we will look to the community for additional requests. And beyond that, with our future roadmap, again, a lot of the influence and trajectory of these offerings are determined by the community and the stakeholders as it applies to bridge management and infrastructure. Those opportunities, again, looking at the future roadmap, they just continue to increase. I will defer to the BrM team to discuss all of the exciting items that they have on the horizon. But again, with AASHTOWare OpenAPI, the portfolio of AASHTOWare products, the goal is to be faster, more agile, more comprehensive, and add more value at the agency level, commercial participants, enterprise systems outside of AASHTOWare, to really just add value in a way that does target future innovation as one of the primary points of our design. So in that, we will complete the standard portion of our webinar, and we will now open it up to the forum Q&A.
So Cedric, there's several questions that have been submitted, and I guess we can roll through these, and you or Stephen or others from maybe you can answer depending on what's appropriate. The first one is, we have difficulties with connecting to the OpenAPI because it is outside our network. Can OpenAPI be made available inside an agency's network, which I understand is a typical setup for an API? Thank you.
Sure. So a typical setup for an API, really the benefit of having those capabilities as a unified service, I would say 90% or more are outside of a given network. As the AASHTOWare applications are deployed or installed differently, they might actually live in a cloud or a hybrid cloud. But in either case, if you are able to, we typically work with the agency technical staff, so that instead of just making an internal resource open to the entire internet, we take the simple and secure method so that just the AASHTOWare OpenAPI related needs are part of the access to that internal system. Something that we can discuss offline, even though it's in the developer portal, in the event that for whatever reason, there is just absolutely, positively no way to use AASHTOWare OpenAPI through its external routing. We do have contingencies where whatever the agency has in place, the utility is still available, even though the configuration may be different.
Next question, if you have a BRR identity, will that work for BRM?
And I'll defer that to Mayview.
No. So the credentials need to come from BrM itself. And you need to go into the credentials page to issue the client ID and secret.
Thank you, Stephen. Next one, how close to parity with the web application is the API currently? What is the anticipated time frame to getting parity?
The API currently supports 100% of parity with BrM, the BrM product. So everything you can do with the front end, you can do through the API.
Next question, what if your install of 7.0.2 is on-premise and not in the cloud? Would our instance be in configuration somewhere?
Absolutely. So one of our primary deployment modes that we support are on-premise. So that registration, and again, there's some coordination required, typically addressed in the onboarding process. But basically, we get the URL of your internally deployed system. We apply a registration. We ensure that there is access from AASHTOWare OpenAPI through a very unique, isolated, and secure channel. And then from that point, using the instance alias as we discussed, your internal system has the ability to be externally accessible through that narrow channel and secured communication capability within AASHTOWare OpenAPI. But there are several agencies that do not allow external access. They run on premise, and that is part of the benefit and utility of AASHTOWare OpenAPI, is that it does not require a great deal of internet infrastructure to make it usable.
Next question, can we get bridge ID and their GPS coordinates for all bridges in a state using a single API call?
I'll defer to Mayview on that one.
So I believe those are two different calls. You have to fetch the bridges first, and then you have to get the asset location second. So those are two calls.
And that would be a candidate for a recipe.
Next question, do you specify the endpoints needed, or do you just create standard endpoints when creating the API?
So typically, and this would really focus on consuming the API, using the API. So typically, we always have the root of all APIs delivered through the system, api.ashtower.org, then for BrM, /BrM. And then from that point, once you have your instance, the API is exactly the same. So you would have more or less a root URL that you would start with. And then based on the API operation that you want, your remaining path and potential inputs would really just be the only thing that changes.
The next question, is there a way for a BrM 6.7 user to test or play with the API?
Sure, I think this will require a two-part answer. So on the AASHTOWare OpenAPI side, the sandbox that we looked at today, that is kind of a shared lab environment. It won't reflect agency-specific data, but in terms of the API operations, how it works, what you need to do, that is 100% representative. And then I'll defer to Mayview in how best to make that jump from the sandbox lab environment to preliminary non-production 7.0.2 environments, with the expectation that 6.7 is still active. So I'll hand that over to Mayview.
So to answer the question simply, if you're on 6.7 and you want to try it out, the sandbox is the way to do it. And Cedric and I can work out how we can get you on board of the sandbox. Certainly email us and we'll get you on board there. In terms of how to do it with your data, this is part of the enterprise hosting SKU that Mayview has been doing as part of our transition to upgrade individuals to cloud hosting. There are ways to transition if you're on the cloud hosting so that you can run a sample environment as you're still working with 6.7. I'd encourage you to reach out to Anthony and Sarah if you want to inquire more about that path.
The next question, does the API support cores?
Yes. So just to kind of expound on the registration process, for each individual registration, so again, shared lab environment, that's a little bit different because more than one organization is using it, it's a shared resource. But when we have individual registrations, whether it's an agency or if you want to commission a specialized just for you sandbox hosted by Mayview, we have the ability to adjust that registration for cores, rate throttling, IP restrictions, anything and everything that you would typically expect from a robust web firewall, web application firewall rule set. We have the ability to apply that just to a unique registration, cores included.
Okay, the next question, when will the reference code quick start and the code recipe page example page of the developer's website be completed?
So all of the developer portal content will perpetually be a work in progress based on the feedback from the developer community, from stakeholders. We do update the developer portal fairly frequently. So some of the information that we've discussed today, that will be next up for publication on the developer portal. But again, over the next few years, as each of these systems evolve and even more APIs are provided, recipes, code samples, case studies, the core scenarios, all of that reference content will be incorporated into the developer portal.
What BrM features are not being supported in the API? Do they affect a transition?
We'll give that to Mayview.
So I'm not sure the intention of the last question with the transition. But as we said before, the API is pretty full featured. I think about the only thing that the API doesn't do is like the administrations, like onboarding users, offboarding users, like those types of things. But the functional intent should be covered within BrM. Again, I'm not sure who posted the last one, or if we want to follow up on the transition question. But that would be an opportunity if you wanted to reach out to shoot us an email, and we'd be happy to respond.
Wonderful. And I'll add just a small point to that. So as part of the AASHTOWare OpenAPI architecture, the way that we work with BrM, the way that we work with all AASHTOWare products, especially with a major release or major update as seen in the latest version of BrM, the what and the how may change over time. However, the fundamental API, the ability to retrofit, the necessity to have backwards compatibility starting now, so 7.0.2 and the future, the design and approach is to make sure that we have retrofits, make sure that the how and what are extremely similar. So with the exception of 6.7 to the current version, there is a expected continuity and enhancement extensibility as compared to fundamental changes that we're seeing between 6.7 and the current.
Okay. Next question, how can I obtain the specific agency or test instance?
Wonderful. So if you are affiliated with an agency organization and you are, you can either get that information from whoever performed the registration or simply put in a support request and it can be provided. If you are not affiliated with an agency, a DOT organization, so for example, if you're an enterprise developer, integrator, commercial party, what we recommend is finding an agency to become a data buddy with, and then the non-production resources of that agency can be registered for use in enterprise development, commercial endeavors, integrator commissions. So again, if you're outside of the agency, you do need to pair up with an agency to get access. The application still controls all permissions. So the first step, if you're not affiliated with an agency, is to become affiliated with an agency. If you're part of an existing agency, simply submit a support request and we will get that the instance aliases over to you.
Next question, are there other ways to access the bridge data from internal agency applications? For instance, OData connections like we use in AASHTOWare project.
So no, BrM currently only supports access to the data through OpenAPI or the web app itself.
Next question, parity question follow-up. Does the API include methods related to the optimizer?
So the optimizer is not releasing until 7.1. Given that's a product that we're releasing in the near future, but is not live right now, I don't have a good answer for you. But again, once we get to 7.1, if you want to email, we can kind of go through those. You want to look through the developer documentation, look through it. You're welcome to.
Next question, is a single sandbox provided by AASHTOWare will be shared by all developers, or each developer will get a separate sandbox? How much real data will be available in the sandbox?
I think that'll be another two-part question. I'll do the first part and then hand it over. So the sandbox is a shared resource that is basically the lab environment that everyone would use. There is the ability to commission or provision bespokes just for you, may view, or if you're currently licensed and have installed the product, then we have the ability to register that no differently. But in order to do that, I'll defer to Mayview as far as all of the different options to have a non-production resource, representative data that is dedicated and not part of that shared sandbox. And maybe what are some of the options for interested parties to basically either spin up on their own or to have Mayview host a dedicated environment just for their isolated use?
So I would say reach out to us and we can have a conversation. I mean, obviously that would involve getting a license of BrM first and foremost, as well as they want to host it on their own, do an on-premise setup or a cloud one. But I would just say email us.
The next question, are there options available for a developer to host their own development sandbox?
I actually think we just answered that last question.
So next question, how soon does the security token expire?
I will hand that one to Mayview.
So this is configurable on the instance. The default expiry is every 30 minutes. The client ID and secret is good for a year. The sandbox environment is configured for a token expiry every 30 minutes.
Question, is the data in the sandbox refreshed periodically?
Yes, the data in the sandbox is refreshed weekly at this point.
And the last question we have is the BrM developer license still available?
That one would refer to Anthony or Sarah.
Sorry, I was muted. No, I don't believe the developer license is still available. It's really an AASHTO question if Ben's on the call, but I don't believe that's in the FY26 catalog.
Thanks, Sarah. Developer license is not currently in the catalog. I will point you to AASHTOWare.org to the Alliance program and to submit any questions about working through OpenAPI and BrM through the Alliance program and through OpenAPI. Feel free to send me an email, bsade@ashtow.org, if you have any additional questions. Thanks.
Wonderful. And Tim, I think that has cleared the queue as far as questions. If there are any last minute items, please feel free to add them into the Q&A. But on that particular note, just to really reemphasize as far as today's webinar, the intent was to cover some of the basics. BrM is far too extensive to hit all of the different scenarios and exploration areas that we could within a 90-minute period. In addition to that, future roadmap, innovation, capabilities, those are all driven by stakeholder input from the developer community, from the user community. So once today is completed, we do offer the ability to put some of those suggestions, requests, wish list items, ideas, whether it's from integrating additional AASHTOWare systems, making the most of what is on the horizon in terms of AI, whatever's on your mind and can contribute to the future of both AASHTOWare OpenAPI and BrM. Please feel free to include that in the post-webinar survey question set. And if there are no other questions, I think that will conclude today's session. Thank you everyone for your time. And again, this latest version of BrM and the API capabilities are extremely exciting. And we hope in the future we can continue the webinar series to really take advantage of those new capabilities.